Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. But there is no proof that Solomon's temple ever existed until now. It could be the only surviving evidence of the Temple of Solomon.
For 100 years, scholars called Solomon's temple a myth. No proof it ever existed. No one allowed to dig beneath Jerusalem's Temple Mount to check. So scientists built something that needed no permission. A machine that could see through solid rock without touching it. They lowered it into a dark cave beside the Temple Mount and pointed it straight at the one place archaeologists have spent 100 years afraid to look. When the readings came back, the room went silent. Shapes that should not exist. Empty chambers with no explanation. Patterns no earthquake or crumbling rock could ever create. And before this is over, you will see exactly what the Bible said was hiding down there. 3,000 years before anyone had the technology to check. The ground no one is allowed to touch. There is a hill in Jerusalem that no archaeologist on earth is allowed to touch. It covers 35 acres. 3 religions call it holy ground. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all point to this exact patch of earth and say, this matters more than almost anywhere else on the planet. And for 3,000 years, people have been willing to fight for it. The Bible says something happened on this hill that changed history. It says King Solomon built a temple here, so grand it took 180,000 laborers 7 years to finish it. Cedar wood shipped in from Lebanon, gold covering the walls inside. And at the very center, in a sealed room with no windows, sat the most sacred object in ancient Israel, the Ark of the Covenant. That is the story. But here is the problem that has tortured historians for over 100 years. Nobody has ever been allowed to dig here, not once, not properly. The surface of this hill is controlled by the Islamic Waqf. Access to the site is controlled by Israel. Both sides treat this ground the way you would treat a bomb that could go off at any second because it has happened before. Real riots, real violence, international crises that started over far less than a shovel breaking ground on sacred soil. One wrong move here does not just anger a few people, it can shake an entire region. So while other ancient mysteries get solved with a pickaxe and a research grant, this one has sat completely untouched, frozen, sealed off from the one thing that usually answers questions like this: excavation. That silence created a gap, and skeptics rushed to fill it. For decades, respected scholars said the same thing. They said there were no temple remains, no physical evidence anywhere on this hill. They argued that Jerusalem in Solomon's time was probably just a small hill town, not a capital, not a kingdom. Just a cluster of huts described as something grand in an old book. Here is what that means in simple terms. For 100 years, top archaeologists were free to call one of the most sacred stories in human history a myth. Not because they had proof it was false, they just could not prove it was true. And the one place that could settle the question, the Temple Mount itself, was completely off limits. Picture spending your entire career studying this exact mystery, knowing the proof might be sitting just a few feet beneath your boots, and knowing you are never allowed to lift a single stone to check. That is not just a mystery, that is a wound that never gets to heal. So the real question was never simply, is the temple down there? The real question, the one that actually mattered, was bigger than that. Was Solomon's Jerusalem ever real at all? Was it truly a powerful capital city, exactly like the Bible claims? Or was it invented centuries later to make a small, forgotten village sound legendary? For over 100 years, nobody could answer that question with anything except opinions. Then, in 2023, a team of physicists decided they were done guessing. They stopped trying to dig through the ground. Instead, they found a way to listen to something that had been quietly passing through that hill since long before Jerusalem ever existed. The particles that see through stone. Right now, tiny particles are falling through your body. Billions of them, every single second. They come from deep space, born when cosmic rays slam into our atmosphere. They are called muons, and most people will live their whole lives without ever knowing they exist. But a team of scientists realized something extraordinary. These particles could do what no human, no permit, and no political agreement ever could. They could see straight through solid rock, into the one place nobody was allowed to dig. Here is how it works, in simple terms. Muons pass through everything in their path, but solid stone slows them down, while empty space does not. Place a detector underground, measure how fast the muons arrive, and you can tell solid rock apart from a hidden empty chamber. It is an X-ray for the ground, without ever touching the ground. That single detail is why this method got approved in the first place. No permits to dig, no stone disturbed. Nobody could accuse anyone of violating sacred ground, because nobody was ever going to lift a shovel. For the first time, everyone involved had a reason to say yes. Professor Etienne led the effort. He had spent years building detectors for the Large Hadron Collider in Switzerland, one of the most advanced machines on Earth. There, everything is clean and controlled. Jerusalem gave him none of that. In 2023, his team lowered a device the size of a dresser into a dark, cramped cavern beneath the city of David, right beside the Temple Mount. There was no clean lab here, just wet rock, tangled cables, and doctoral students rappelling down narrow rock faces with sensitive equipment strapped to their backs. Knowing one drop piece of gear could destroy months of preparation in a single second. They rebuilt precision physics equipment by hand, underground, in the dark, because there was no other way to reach beneath the most contested ground on Earth without touching it. And here is a detail that should stop you cold. These particles were not new. They had been raining down on this exact hill for millions of years, falling before Solomon was born, before Jerusalem existed at all. In September 2025, the results were published, and they worked. For the first time in history, researchers could see beneath Jerusalem's bedrock without lifting a single stone. What they found were not just gaps in the rock, geometric shapes, consistent spacing, repeated angles that erosion and earthquakes simply do not create, enclosed empty spaces that behaved like chambers, not accidents of nature. The results were not opinions or theories. They were measured data, sitting right there on the screen, impossible to argue away. Once scientists saw it, they had nothing left to dismiss. But here is the problem. Finding the shapes was not the same as understanding them. Nobody could yet say what they were or why they were there. Because before anyone could trust that these hidden spaces meant anything at all, they needed proof of something much bigger. They needed to know if Jerusalem, in Solomon's time, was ever a real city, powerful enough to build something like this in the first place. Without that answer, the machine had only found a mystery. It had not yet solved one. The clock that wasn't supposed to work. Before anyone could trust what the machines had found underground, they needed an answer to a much older question. Was Jerusalem, in Solomon's time, ever a real city? Or was it just a small hill town that could never have built anything close to a temple? Normally, scientists answer a question like this with carbon dating. Every living thing absorbs a tiny amount of radioactive carbon while it is alive, and after it dies, that carbon slowly decays at a known rate. Measure how much is left, and you can calculate the age. But for the exact centuries that mattered most, this tool did not work. Between roughly 800 and 400 before the Common Era, something strange happens to the carbon in the atmosphere. Scientists call it the Hallstatt Plateau. During this window, the readings barely change from year to year. Carbon dating during this period is like trying to read the time off a clock with hands that are stuck. That single blind spot swallowed the entire age of David and Solomon. For 300 years, scientists could not confidently date anything from the one period the whole investigation depended on. A team of Israeli researchers refused to accept that this door was permanently shut. They collected 103 tiny samples, seeds, olive pits, and other scraps of ancient plant life, each one pulled from carefully documented layers of soil across 5 different sites in Jerusalem. Then they compared these samples against ancient tree rings from Europe, which had already recorded tiny yearly changes in the atmosphere for thousands of years without interruption. By lining up the fingerprint of each sample against that steady timeline, a method called wiggle matching, they achieved something almost nobody thought was possible, dating accurate to within a single decade, inside a window that was supposed to be permanently unreadable. The results landed hard. Nearly 1 in every 5 samples dated directly to the age of David and Solomon, the exact century skeptics had dismissed as too early for any real city to exist. One researcher put it plainly. If anything, the evidence pushed his opinion in one direction only. Jerusalem was not a village during this period, it was a city. There was a second twist buried inside the data. A wall long credited to a much later king actually dated earlier, matching a different account written in the Bible itself, one historians had quietly dismissed for years. The old book had gotten the timeline right. The scholars had gotten it wrong. This was the first real answer in the case. The city was real. It was large enough, organized enough, to be exactly what the Bible described. But a real city is not the same as proof of a temple. The machines had found empty chambers underground. Now, scientists needed something even harder to find. Actual physical evidence, sitting on the Temple Mount itself, from the exact period the chambers seemed to be hiding. The buried crime scene. If Jerusalem really was a city capable of building a temple, there was one place that needed to prove it: the Temple Mount itself. Something from that period had to still be sitting there, waiting to be found. The trouble was, in 1999, that proof had almost been destroyed forever. Bulldozers moved in that year. Workers dug a massive pit in the southeastern corner of the mount to build an underground prayer hall. No archaeologist stood watch. No one documented what was coming out of the ground. 400 truckloads of earth were torn out and dumped into a nearby valley, like garbage from a demolition site. Picture that. 400 truckloads, ripped from directly beneath one of the most important religious sites on the entire planet, and thrown away without a second glance. Archaeologists called it one of the worst losses in the history of the field because buried inside that soil could have been exactly the evidence the case needed, and nobody would ever know where in the ground it had actually come from. But instead of walking away, a small group of researchers made a decision. If the soil could not be studied where it came from, they would study every single grain of it by hand, wherever it had landed. That decision became the Sifting Project. For more than 20 years, workers and volunteers sorted through that dumped soil piece by piece, searching for anything the bulldozers had missed. And they found exactly what the case needed: pottery from the era of Solomon and his successors, a rare stone seal, an ancient arrowhead. Then, one discovery that stopped everyone in their tracks: a small clay seal, stamped with ancient Hebrew writing, bearing a name that also appears in the biblical book of Jeremiah. A real object, belonging to a real person whose name had only ever existed in Scripture until that moment. Separately, something even more direct was happening on the mount itself. Between 2007 and the mid-2020s, small supervised digs, carried out quietly during routine maintenance work and watched over by police, uncovered pottery and burned olive pits sitting exactly where they had been left, undisturbed for thousands of years. Carbon dating placed them squarely in the age of the First Temple. One archaeologist summed it up in a single sentence: until this moment, the Temple Mount had been a blank slate. Nobody had any direct evidence at all. Now, for the first time, that blank slate finally had writing on it. The case was building. There was now physical proof sitting on the mount itself from the right time period. But proof of activity was still not proof that anyone had built something as advanced as the temple the Bible described. That answer was waiting 20 miles away, inside a small stone box nobody had opened in 3,000 years. The box that decoded the Bible. Real evidence now sat directly on the mount itself, but one question remained. Did the architecture the Bible described for Solomon's temple ever actually exist, or was it invented later to sound impressive? In 2011, archaeologists were digging through a fortified town called Khirbet Qeiyafa, a settlement built during the time of King David, about 20 miles from Jerusalem. Near the southern gate, on the floor of an old building, they found something small enough to hold in two hands, and important enough to answer that exact question. It was a stone box carved from a single block of soft limestone. Traces of red paint still clung to its surface after 3,000 years. It was a model, a tiny, detailed replica of a sacred building, complete with a carved front and an elaborate doorway. For centuries, scholars had a specific problem. The Bible describes Solomon's temple in careful architectural detail, down to the exact design of its door frames and walls. But some of the original Hebrew words used to describe those features had lost their meaning over time. Scholars argued about it for generations and never reached an answer. Then this small stone box came out of the ground, and the argument was over within days. The carvings on its front showed multiple door frames, nested one inside another, each one stepping deeper toward the center, exactly matching the confusing term used in the Bible for the temple's doorway. Grouped lines across the top matched another term, one describing decorative wooden beams. Two words that had puzzled experts for hundreds of years, solved instantly by a single object pulled from the dirt. The researchers who studied it said something that captures exactly how rare this moment was. Every so often, one discovery lights up an entire lost world. This was one of those times. This box was not sitting alone in an empty field either. It was found inside a real fortified city with massive walls, a governor's palace, and a defensive gate system built to withstand attack. Proof that this was an organized, functioning kingdom, not a scattered village pretending to be something bigger. The case had grown stronger again. The exact architecture described in Scripture had now been confirmed by physical stone, not guesswork. Only one gap remained. Confirming the city existed and confirming its architecture matched the Bible still did not prove this kingdom had the wealth and power to actually build something on the scale of a temple. That answer was sitting in a desert hundreds of miles away. The kingdom behind the myth. One question was left before the case could close. Did this kingdom actually have the power, the wealth, and the organization to build something as massive as Solomon's temple? Or was it still too small to pull off something that ambitious? Deep in the desert, far from Jerusalem, lies a place called Timnah, a copper mining site. Production here did not rise slowly over time. It spiked hard during one specific century, the exact century of David and Solomon. The Bible claims that David conquered this entire region and placed it under his control. Archaeologists found a 5-meter fortified wall at the site, weapons, and a heavily defended gatehouse, all dated to precisely the same period the Bible described. But one detail proves this was not some scattered outpost. Researchers found preserved donkey manure at the mining site, 3,000 years old. When they analyzed what those animals had been eating, they found straw, hay, and even grapes shipped in from the Jerusalem region. Someone was organizing food and moving it across a brutal stretch of desert just to keep mining animals fed hundreds of miles from the capital. That is a functioning supply chain, run by a government capable of planning far beyond its own front door. Even the workers were not treated like disposable slaves. Excavators found they wore finely dyed fabric, skilled craftsmen valued enough to be clothed well, serving a kingdom wealthy enough to afford it. Back in Jerusalem in 2021, archaeologists uncovered a real section of the city's ancient defensive wall, connecting two previously separate pieces of the same structure. The Bible describes Babylonian forces tearing that wall down completely, but this discovery proved parts of it survived. One archaeologist said it plainly. The argument over whether this wall existed is Finnish AD. Then came the dam. In 2025, researchers confirmed a massive dam beneath Jerusalem, built to survive violent droughts and floods almost 3,000 years ago, roughly 40 feet tall and wider than a 2-lane road. Researchers called it the largest dam ever found in Israel and the oldest one ever found in Jerusalem. This was the final piece. And now, the kingdom itself had proven it was rich enough, organized enough, and powerful enough to build something on the scale of a temple. Every question archaeologists could answer without touching the mount had now been answered, which left only one question left standing, one that no shovel, no dig, and no soil sample could ever reach. What was actually sitting inside the hidden chambers, the particles had already found. What the particles are saying right now. Here is where everything finally comes together. Every question archaeology could answer on its own had now been answered. So researchers went back to the one piece of the puzzle that was still sitting unexplained. The hidden chambers the particle detectors had found beneath Jerusalem years earlier. Before, those chambers were just an anomaly, strange shapes with no context. Now they were something else entirely. The final unanswered piece of a case that every other field of science had already confirmed. The city existed. The kingdom existed. The architecture existed. The only thing left unexplained was what was actually sitting inside those sealed spaces underground. This is where artificial intelligence took over. Human researchers could not process the sheer scale of data pouring in from multiple scanning technologies at once. Muon detectors, ground radar, subsurface mapping, all running simultaneously. AI systems combined every stream of information together and found patterns no human eye had caught. Repeated angles, consistent spacing, enclosed voids that lined up with the exact kind of structure a real, wealthy, capable kingdom could have built. Structures that matched everything the previous evidence had already proven was possible. The debate that ate up more than 100 years of scholarly careers, the question of whether Solomon's Jerusalem was ever real, was over. Not because one team wanted it to be true, but because physicists, chemists, archaeologists, and now artificial intelligence, working across completely different fields, had all landed on the same answer. And this is not finished. It is only getting started. Professor Etienne and his team are now building a network of roughly 50 muon detectors across Jerusalem. Once running, researchers will combine every stream of data together to build a complete three-dimensional map of everything hidden beneath the surface. Every tunnel, every sealed chamber, mapped without a single excavation, without disturbing one grain of sacred soil. This same method already uncovered a hidden chamber deep inside Egypt's Great Pyramid. Now, it is aimed directly at the most contested ground on the planet. But here is what still remains genuinely unknown. The voids beneath the Temple Mount are confirmed to exist. What they actually are has not been confirmed. Nobody has stood inside them. The particles can tell us something is there. They cannot yet tell us exactly what it is. That is not a disappointing ending. That is the most important part of this entire story. Right now, in this exact moment, particles that have been falling since long before Solomon ever lived are still passing through that hill, still being caught and decoded by machines his own builders could never have imagined. The investigation has not closed. It has finally been given the tools to actually see. We are no longer forced to wonder in silence. We are finally listening.